You used to be able to lose yourself in things. A movie would sweep you away, a good meal would fill you with simple satisfaction, music would move through you without your permission. But somewhere along the way, something changed. Now, when you watch that movie, you are analyzing the cinematography, deconstructing the narrative structure, predicting the plot points before they arrive. The meal becomes a catalogue of ingredients and cooking techniques, or worse, a silent calculation of calories and nutritional content. The music triggers thoughts about music theory, cultural context, the artist's biography, anything except the pure sensation of sound. You have become a spectator to your own experience, watching yourself fail to feel what you know you should be feeling. The pleasure is there, you can see it. Like looking at something beautiful through thick glass, but you cannot touch it anymore. You cannot sink into it. Every moment of potential joy is interrupted by the voice in your head that will not stop narrating, analyzing, contextualizing, making meaning out of what should simply be felt. And you are exhausted. Exhausted from thinking, from the endless internal commentary, from being unable to just be present without simultaneously being aware that you are trying to be present, which of course ruins the whole thing. You have tried everything. Meditation that becomes another thing to analyze. Mindfulness that turns into self-conscious performance. Gratitude practices that feel forced and hollow. The irony is not lost on you, that your attempts to recover spontaneous feeling have themselves become objects of thought, feeding the very problem they were meant to solve. You wonder if something is broken in you, if you have thought yourself into a corner you cannot think your way out of. What I want to explore with you is something that Hannah Arendt understood deeply about the nature of thinking itself, about what happens to human beings when the vita contemplativa, the life of the mind, becomes not just a capacity, but a prison. This is not about positive thinking your way back to pleasure. This is about understanding the price of consciousness, the toll that thinking takes on the immediate experience of being alive. And more importantly, this is about whether that price was inevitable and what remains when the simple pleasures fade away. Let us begin with a simple observation that is anything but simple in its implications. Thinking, real thinking, not just daydreaming or mental chatter but genuine reflective thought, is fundamentally a distancing activity. When you think about something, you necessarily create space between yourself and that thing. You step back from it. You turn it into an object of contemplation. This is what thinking does by its very nature. It takes what is immediate and makes it mediate. It takes what is experienced and makes it analyzed. Arendt understood this when she wrote about the thinking ego versus the willing ego versus the self that simply exists in the world. The thinking self is never identical with the experiencing self. It is always a step removed, always observing, always creating that fatal gap between experience and awareness of experience. This gap, this distance that thinking creates, is both the source of all human insight and the death of spontaneous joy. Consider the child who tastes ice cream for the first time. There is no gap. There is only the cold sweetness, the texture, the pleasure flowing directly into being without passing through the filter of thought. The child does not think, I am experiencing pleasure from ice cream. The child is the pleasure. But you with your developed consciousness, your capacity for reflection, you can never have that experience again. When you eat ice cream, you know you are eating ice cream. You remember other ice cream. You compare, you analyze the flavor profile. You think about the sugar content. You wonder if you will regret it later. You observe yourself eating it. You observe yourself trying to enjoy it. You observe yourself observing yourself. And in all of that observation, where is the simple pleasure? It has been murdered by consciousness. This is what you are experiencing, what has been slowly happening to you over years of developing your capacity to think. You have become very good at thinking. Perhaps too good. Your mind has become a machine that cannot be turned off, that processes everything, that must understand and categorize and analyze every input. This is often framed as intelligence, as depth, as sophistication. And it is those things. But it is also a curse, because the more developed your thinking becomes, the more impossible it is to have an unmediated relationship with anything. Everything must pass through the mill of consciousness, and something essential is lost in that grinding process. The juice is pressed out, What remains is comprehension without vitality, understanding without feeling. You might think this is just about overthinking specific experiences, that if you could just quiet your mind during certain activities, you could recover the pleasure. But what Arendt understood, and what you are discovering, is that this is not a bug of consciousness but a feature. The thinking self cannot help but think. It is its nature. Telling yourself not to think is like telling your heart not to beat. The very attempt creates more thinking, more self-observation, more distance. The moment you become aware that you are trying not to think, you have already failed, because that awareness itself is thinking. You are trapped in what we might call the prison of metacognition. You cannot experience anything without simultaneously being aware that you are experiencing it, and that awareness transforms the experience into something else entirely. If this perspective is opening something up for you, consider subscribing. I explore these territories of consciousness and its burdens every week, and I would be honored to have you along for the journey. Now we must ask a harder question. Why does thinking destroy pleasure specifically? Why not just transform it into something else, something perhaps deeper if less intense? To understand this, we need to examine what pleasure actually is in its most basic form. Pleasure is a kind of surrender. It is allowing yourself to be moved by something outside yourself, allowing an experience to wash over you and carry you along. It is fundamentally passive in the best sense of that word. It requires a kind of openness, a receptivity, a willingness to be affected without controlling or directing the experience. But thinking is the opposite of surrender. Thinking is active, controlling, directing. Thinking takes the reins. Thinking says, I will not simply be moved, I will understand what is moving me and how and why. Thinking refuses to be carried away. It stands firm and observes. And in that standing firm, in that refusal to surrender, pleasure becomes impossible. Consider what happens when you try to enjoy music while simultaneously analyzing it. Part of you is listening, but another part, the thinking part, is breaking down the chord progressions, noticing the production techniques, comparing it to other music you know, forming opinions about its quality and originality. That thinking part cannot surrender to the music because it is busy doing something else. It is working. And pleasure, real pleasure, is not work. It is the opposite of work. It is a kind of grace, a gift that can only be received, never achieved. But your thinking mind knows only achievement. It knows only effort and analysis and the production of meaning. So it takes even your leisure time and turns it into labor. The labor of understanding. The labor of having correct opinions, the labor of being conscious and aware and intellectually engaged at all times. No wonder you are exhausted. This connects to something Arendt wrote about extensively, though in a different context, the loss of the capacity for experience in modern life. She was concerned with how political and historical events were making genuine experience impossible, how the pace and violence of modernity were overwhelming human capacities for absorption and integration. But we can extend her insight here. The internal pace of your own thinking has become a kind of violence against your own experience. Your thoughts move too quickly, process too much, demand too much attention. There is no space for things to simply land and be felt. Everything is immediately swept up into the machinery of analysis before it can sink in. You consume experiences, but you do not digest them. They pass through you, but they do not nourish you. You are starving in the midst of plenty because you cannot stop processing long enough to actually eat. Let me give you another way of understanding this through a concept Arendt used, the internal dialogue of thinking. She described thinking as a conversation you have with yourself, the two in one, the split that occurs when consciousness turns back on itself. This internal dialogue is what makes humans human, what gives us our capacity for moral reasoning and philosophical reflection. But it also means we are never alone. Even in solitude, there is always the thinker and the one thought about, the questioner and the questioned. This might sound abstract, but you know exactly what this feels like. You know the constant presence of that other voice, that observer self that is always commenting on everything you do. That voice is thinking, and that voice will not shut up. The problem is that pleasure requires a kind of unity, a temporary collapse of that internal split. When you are genuinely experiencing pleasure, there is no observer. There is only the experience. The two in one becomes one again, however briefly. But your thinking habit, your developed capacity for reflection, maintains that split constantly. The observer never leaves. Even in moments that should be pleasurable, there it is, noting and commenting and analyzing. Did you really enjoy that? Was it as good as last time? What does it mean that you are trying so hard to enjoy it? Why do you feel guilty for taking pleasure in this? Should you be doing something more productive? Round and round the thoughts go, and meanwhile the moment that could have been pleasurable is spent on that internal debate. The experience itself barely registers because you were too busy thinking about the experience. I know many of you watching this have never told anyone what you are really experiencing. You have been carrying this alone, maybe for years, thinking that something is fundamentally wrong with you, that everyone else can simply enjoy things while you are trapped in your head. But here is what I want you to understand. The moment you name this, the moment you acknowledge it out loud, even just in a comment, something shifts. You stop being alone with it. So let me ask you directly, when did you first notice this happening? When did you realize that thinking too much was stealing your ability to feel pleasure? I want you to share in the comments, not because I need engagement, but because someone else watching this needs to see your words. They need to know they are not the only one, and if you cannot find the words right now, if it feels too heavy to articulate, just type this: I analyze everything to death. That is it. Just those 5 words, because when you do, you create permission for dozens of others to say it too. Your honesty, your willingness to be seen in your struggle, it helps break the silence that keeps all of us isolated. So comment below. Tell me where you are in this. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not alone in what you are experiencing. Now we must turn to an even more difficult question. Is there a way back? Can you unlearn this? Can you recover the capacity for simple pleasure that thinking has taken from you? And here, I must tell you something that might not be what you want to hear, but it is true. No, you cannot simply go back. Consciousness, once developed, does not reverse itself. You cannot unknow what you know. You cannot unthink what you have thought. The innocence of immediate experience, the child eating ice cream without self-awareness, that is gone for you. Not temporarily but permanently. This is the price of thinking. This is what it costs to develop consciousness. And no amount of meditation or mindfulness or intentional presence will give you back what consciousness has taken away. Those practices might give you something else, something valuable in its own right, but they will not give you back unmediated experience. That door is closed. This might sound bleak, and in a sense it is. There is a real loss here, a real sacrifice. The vita contemplativa, the life of the mind, does exact a toll on the vita activa, the life of action and experience in the world. Arendt knew this. She knew that thinking separates us from the immediate flow of life, that it makes us in some sense less alive, even as it makes us more conscious. The thinker is always slightly removed from life, slightly at a distance, slightly alienated from the simple being that other creatures enjoy without question. This is the human condition for those who think deeply. We pay for our consciousness with a kind of exile from immediate existence. But, and this is crucial, this does not mean you are doomed to a life without any pleasure or meaning or satisfaction. It means that those things must come from somewhere else now. Different sources, different forms. You will not get pleasure from the same places you used to get it. You will not lose yourself in simple sensory experiences the way you once could. But you can find something else, something that Arendt called the pleasure of thinking itself. There is a satisfaction that comes from understanding, from clarity, from seeing patterns and connections that others miss. There is a deep fulfillment that comes from the examined life, from refusing easy answers, from sitting with complexity and ambiguity. This is not the same as the pleasure of eating ice cream without thinking about eating ice cream. It is colder, more austere, but it is real, and it is available to you in a way that simpler pleasures may no longer be. What you are experiencing is not a disorder to be fixed, but a transformation to be integrated. You have not lost the ability to feel pleasure because something is wrong with you. You have lost a certain kind of pleasure because you have developed a certain kind of consciousness. This is an exchange, not a theft. You gave up one thing to gain another. Whether that exchange was worth it is not something I can tell you. It is not even something you can fully decide, because by the time you are aware enough to make that choice, the exchange has already happened. You are already too conscious to go back to unconsciousness. The question is not whether you can recover what you have lost. The question is what you will do with what you have gained. Let me offer you a different way to think about pleasure itself, because perhaps what you are mourning is not actually what you have lost. The pleasure you remember from before, the unthinking enjoyment, it was real, but it was also incomplete. It was pleasure without awareness, sensation without consciousness, feeling without understanding. It had a kind of purity, yes, but also a kind of emptiness. It did not mean anything. It just was. And perhaps what you are really struggling with is not the absence of that kind of pleasure, but the presence of a new need that has emerged. The need for experiences to have meaning, depth, significance. You cannot enjoy things shallowly anymore because you have tasted something deeper. You cannot lose yourself in distraction because you have found yourself in contemplation. And once you have found yourself, you cannot unfind yourself without a kind of violence against your own being. This is where Arendt's concept of natality becomes relevant. Natality, the human capacity for new beginnings, for starting something that did not exist before. You cannot go back to who you were before thinking transformed you, but you can begin again from where you are now. You can stop trying to recover simple pleasure and instead discover what pleasure means for a thinking being. Maybe it is the pleasure of finally understanding something that has puzzled you for years. Maybe it is the pleasure of articulation, of finding exactly the right words for an experience. Maybe it is the pleasure of solitude, of the internal dialogue with yourself that Arendt described, the two in one engaged in genuine discourse. Maybe it is the pleasure of reading something that resonates so deeply it feels like coming home. These are the pleasures of consciousness itself, not pleasures from turning consciousness off, but pleasures from turning consciousness on even more fully. Let me describe what this might look like practically, not as instruction but as possibility. Instead of going to a movie and trying desperately not to analyze it, trying to force yourself to just enjoy it, like you imagine everyone else does, what if you went to the movie and allowed yourself to analyze it fully? What if you stopped fighting your nature and instead leaned into it? You would watch the film, yes, but you would also observe the craft of it, the choices the director made, the themes being explored, the ways it connects to other films or to the world itself. You would have thoughts about it, many thoughts, and instead of experiencing those thoughts as interference with enjoyment, you would recognize them as their own form of engagement, perhaps deeper and more satisfying than passive consumption ever was. The pleasure would be different, cooler, more intellectual, requiring more effort, but it would be yours. It would be real. It would be appropriate to who you have become. This is not settling for second best. This is recognizing that you are not the same person you were before consciousness deepened. You are someone else now, someone who cannot help but think, who cannot help but analyze, who cannot help but seek meaning and understanding in everything. This is not a flaw, this is who you are. And who you are deserves pleasures suited to their nature, not the remembered pleasures of a different person who no longer exists. When you stop trying to be who you were and allow yourself to be who you are, new possibilities open. Not the same possibilities, but different ones. Ones that honor your consciousness rather than fight against it. There is something Arendt wrote about the life of the mind that applies here. She said that thinking is essentially out of order. It disrupts, it questions, it refuses to accept things as they are presented. This is why it is so uncomfortable, why it makes simple pleasure impossible. But it is also why it is so valuable. Thinking is what allows us to see through appearances, to question what we are told, to imagine things could be different. Yes, it ruins the movie because you cannot help but see the scaffolding behind the illusion. But it also means you cannot be fooled by propaganda, cannot be satisfied with shallow explanations, cannot live an unexamined life. The same faculty that destroys simple pleasure is the faculty that creates meaning, morality, and the possibility of wisdom. You cannot have one without the other. So we arrive at a kind of paradox, one that Arendt herself would appreciate. The thinking that has taken away your ability to feel simple pleasure is the same thinking that has given you the ability to understand your loss. The consciousness that makes immediate experience impossible is the consciousness that makes this conversation possible. You are reading this or hearing this or thinking about this because you are the kind of person who thinks deeply, who cannot help but reflect on their own experience, who must understand. And that very capacity is what you are mourning. You are thinking about thinking too much. The meta continues. It never stops. There is no escape from consciousness through consciousness. There is only going deeper into it, accepting it, working with it rather than against it. What if I told you that the exhaustion you feel is not from thinking too much, but from fighting thinking too much? Consider how much energy you spend trying not to think, trying to quiet your mind, trying to just be present, trying to force yourself to feel what you no longer feel spontaneously. That struggle, that resistance to your own nature, that is what is wearing you out. The thinking itself might actually require less energy than fighting the thinking. What if you stopped fighting? What if you said, yes, I am someone who thinks constantly, who analyzes everything, who cannot experience anything without also being aware of experiencing it, and that is okay? That is who I am. Not wrong, not broken, just different. Different from who I was before, different from people who can turn their minds off, but not worse, just different. This acceptance is not the same as resignation. It is not giving up on ever enjoying anything again. It is giving up on a particular idea of enjoyment that no longer fits who you are. It is allowing new forms of satisfaction to emerge, forms that work with your thinking rather than trying to bypass it. When you stop seeing your consciousness as the enemy of pleasure, you might discover that consciousness itself can be pleasurable. Not in the same way, not with the same intensity of simple sensation, but with a different quality. The pleasure of clarity, the pleasure of understanding, the pleasure of seeing something that was hidden before, the pleasure of the internal dialogue that Arendt described, the conversation with yourself that is both solitary and accompanied. If what I am sharing here resonates with something you have been feeling, something you have not quite been able to name, then I want you to know you are not alone in this. There are many of us exploring these questions, sitting with these uncomfortable truths, learning to live with forms of consciousness that are as much burden as gift. I create these videos for people who think too much, who analyze too deeply, who cannot turn their minds off and have stopped trying. People who are looking not for ways to think less, but for ways to think about thinking differently, to make peace with the kind of consciousness they have developed. If that is you, consider subscribing. Not because you need another channel to follow, but because this journey of understanding yourself, of accepting the price you have paid for awareness, it helps to have companions along the way. People who will not tell you to just relax and enjoy life, who will not offer you meditation apps and mindfulness exercises, who will instead sit with you in the complexity of what it means to be a thinking being in a world that often seems designed for people who think less. I will be here every week with another exploration, another perspective, another thread to pull on. And I would be honored to have you here as part of this community of overthinkers and deep feelers, and people who have discovered that consciousness is both the problem and the only way through the problem. So if this feels right, hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments when you first noticed this happening to you, or just type those 5 words, I analyze everything to death, and become part of the conversation we are having about what it costs to be awake. So where does this leave you? You cannot go back to unthinking pleasure. You cannot turn off your consciousness. You cannot unlearn what you have learned or unsee what you have seen. The movie will always be deconstructed even as you watch it. The meal will always be analyzed even as you eat it. The music will always trigger thoughts about music even as you listen. This is your reality now. But maybe, just maybe, this reality is not a prison. Maybe it is a different kind of freedom. The freedom to understand what you are experiencing, even if you cannot lose yourself in it. The freedom to see clearly even if clarity is sometimes painful. The freedom to live an examined life, even if the examination makes certain forms of enjoyment impossible. Arendt believed that the life of the mind was its own justification, that thinking was not a means to something else, but an end in itself. She did not promise that thinking would make you happy, or that consciousness would bring pleasure. She only insisted that thinking was essential to being fully human, that the unexamined life, as Socrates said, is not worth living. You have paid a price for your examined life. You have given up the ability to simply enjoy things without simultaneously thinking about enjoying them. But you have gained something too. You have gained yourself, the self that thinks, that questions, that refuses easy answers and simple pleasures. The self that is alone even in company because it is engaged in constant internal dialogue. The self that Arendt described, the two in one, never unified, but also never entirely separate. Perhaps the real question is not how to recover pleasure, but how to find meaning in a life where pleasure has been complicated by consciousness. And the answer might be that the meaning is in the complication itself, in refusing to accept things as they appear, in looking deeper, in thinking more rather than less, in accepting that you are someone who lives primarily in the vita contemplativa, the contemplative life, rather than the vita activa, the active life of unreflective engagement with the world. There is a place for people like you, a role. Not everyone can think deeply. Not everyone will pay the price you have paid. But someone must. Someone must ask the hard questions, must refuse easy answers, must sit with complexity and ambiguity, and the loss of simple pleasures in pursuit of something else, something harder to name, but no less real. You started this video looking for a way back to pleasure. I cannot give you that, no one can. But I can give you permission to stop looking for it. Permission to accept that you have changed, that consciousness has transformed you irreversibly, and that this transformation, while costly, is also valuable. Permission to find different sources of satisfaction, different meanings, different ways of being in the world. Permission to be exactly who you have become, a person who thinks too much, who analyzes everything, who cannot turn off their mind. Not because you should learn to live with a disability, but because this is not a disability. It is a capacity, one that makes certain things impossible but makes other things possible for the first time. The price of thinking too much is the loss of simple pleasure. That is true. That is real. That is what you are experiencing. But what you have gained is the ability to understand that you have lost simple pleasure, to think about what that means, to explore these questions with depth and nuance and honesty. You have gained the examined life. Whether that is a fair exchange, whether consciousness is worth its cost, I cannot tell you. Only you can answer that question, but you cannot answer it by trying to reverse the exchange. You can only answer it by accepting what you have become and deciding what to do with it. The thinking will not stop. The analysis will not cease. The observer self will not go away. So what will you do with it? How will you live with the consciousness you have developed? That is the real question. And it is a question worth thinking about.